Hello everyone! Patch 8.1 has released, and well, I think we finally have a somewhat substantial balance patch. I'll get into what I mean by somewhat later, but there's honestly a lot I have to talk about here, and some pretty interesting stuff, so be sure to subscribe if you want to see more patch breakdowns, because there is another one confirmed, and let's get started. So, the first buff, which is technically on the player controls page, is to Brellas. There will be a change to make it so that Brellas open up faster on the other player's screen, meaning shield latency should not be as big a deal in the future. They talked about this a lot at the end to specify why as well, which is really cool. This is a big change that's going to be a nice buff for literally all Brellas. I don't know if it's enough to let us see anything besides Tent in competitive play, but regardless, this has been a huge issue with using the weapons in general that I think is incredibly worth noting. The only other notable things in the quality of life I'm going to mention is the scattered weapon and gear of a player will vanish faster, as well as the ink when transforming from swim to human form, both of which will make it easier to see and reduce visual clutter in a fight, which is nice. Okay, let's get into the actual changes. Aerospray is getting a 3% paint buff. It's another random Aerospray painting buff. I don't have anything to say about this one. Next up is Blaster, getting the change that Rapid got last patch. 3 frames faster to begin recovering your ink, which is gonna be decently helpful. It's not gonna be too much, but like with Rapid, it's a nice quality of life to keep up the weapon's uptime. Clash Blaster is getting a 4% strafe speed increase. Very small, but given the state of this weapon as a noob stomper, I'm surprised it's getting anything. Now we get into some more impactful changes. S-Blast is getting a fire rate buff of 5 frames. Yup, that's right, it stole Machine's frame data. So, I want to clarify what this means exactly. If you shoot, go into squid form, and then shoot again, nothing is going to change. But if you just fire the weapon twice, you're going to have 5 frames less delay. This is going to make the short-range mode of S-Blast feel really similar to Luna. Don't get me wrong, Luna is still 15 frames faster, but with the extra blast radius size and better kit, I think the close-range fighting capability of these two weapons are going to be much more similar. The long-range mode should still be relatively aim-dependent with a small AoE, but 5 frames less of a kill time is going to make it a lot easier for you to get a follow-up shot. I think this weapon is going to play much more similar to Luna though. The only changes compared to Luna, you're going to have to be careful to make sure both shots are going to hit the opponent without you having to readjust via swimming. Definitely a massive change I'm very excited to try out. Carbon Roller is getting a very similar buff to the other rollers, being that its horizontal flick will get a little bit of extra kill range for its one shot and 50 damage, making it much more reliable. In addition to that though, its vertical flick will also have a bit of a bigger hitbox to make it easier to hit opponents. Definitely a huge buff in making Carbon Roller more reliable, and that is a trait that's very strong on Vanilla Roller. Is it going to be enough for Carbon? I'm not sure. It kind of depends just how good horizontal flick is. If this is going to be comparable to Splatoon 1 Carbon horizontal flick though, that's going to be a major buff. Speaking of major buffs, Dynamo Roller is finally getting a paint change, trying to adjust it to make sure there's fewer gaps in inking than before. Now, Dynamo's paint is currently very inconsistent. Sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's not. And this patch seems like it's trying to make it more consistent. But I don't know how good this paint is going to be now. But that's going to be a big change if it is a lot. Dynamo's paint is the biggest issue with the weapon right now, since it needs to get a lot of coolers in order to function in the role it's in. If this change allows it to paint enough to get more coolers, I think we could honestly see some Dynamo picks, because its horizontal flick damage is not bad right now. Really curious to see how this is going to go. Big Swig Roller is getting a buff to its damage from 35 to 40. Not changing anything else, it's just making it so that the horizontal swings do a little bit more. Compared to the recent Big Swig changes we've gone, this one's more impactful. The weapon's damage is still laughably far behind other options, but at least this is a buff in the direction the weapon needs. It's going to be easier to combo vertical flick, and if someone runs at you, use a horizontal for a reliable kill. Inkbrush and Octobrush will both have better collision to hit opponents. I think this is probably going to mean that the flicks come out a bit closer to the brush, because currently there is a bit of a dead zone if you're next to the opponent that doesn't hit anyone, because the brush itself doesn't have a hitbox. That could be what it's fixing here. That would be my guess, which means it should be a little bit more reliable to hit people very close to you. I don't think it's going to be a major change, but it's definitely nice. Dousers are getting a big change, reducing the ink consumption by 14%, which would be for standard fire and in its dodge roll mode, as well as making the dodge roll 2% cheaper. I think paint is the bigger problem with Douser right now that it could use to get adjusted, but this is still a huge change given that it's a burst bomb weapon that's going to give it access to that a lot more. I think this is still going to be a very impactful buff, and it's another weapon I'm very curious to see what people do with. Recycle Bro will regen its shield a third of a second faster. Not a major change, but Recycle already gets its shield back so fast that it's definitely going to be something you notice. While there's no changes to subs, there's a good bit of special changes. Reef Slider is getting a buff and a nerf. The 70 damage explosion radius is being increased by 10%. I mean, it was already really large, but sure, why not? This is actually here to trade off a paint nerf of about 5%, which I'm not upset with. I think a 5% nerf will actually prevent Zones cheese on a few maps, but not all of them. It's just gonna mean that you require a bit more special power up on a lot of these maps. I'm still glad that Reef Slider cheese is being toned back, but this feels like a half adjustment that's still keeping it in the game. Still, I think it's an overall positive change to reduce Reef Slider cheese, but buff the special. If you shot an ink vacuum shot at a wall, it would not paint the floor. Same for the floor to the wall. Now it will paint both. Nice. The Super Chumps will now explode half a second faster than they did previously, making it so the opponents have a little bit less time to shoot them down. Very simple change, don't got a lot to say here, but I think it is a solid buff. Alright, so I've liked pretty much most of the changes in this patch. This is one I'm not a big fan of. Inkjet and Trizuka are getting reduced damage to Big Bubbler by about 33%. Now look, I have my issues with Big Bubbler, but I think this is an odd way to nerf it. It was already pretty effective against both Jetpack and Trizuka, not that it needed to be better against Inkjet anyway, and changing like this is only going to make it so you're more dependent on stuff like Tri-Strike in order to counter it. To me, this just limits the options you can pick in a Big Bubbler, while at the same time not actually changing any of the things that are actively harming Big Bubbler from seeing much use. It's just an odd direction to buff the special that I think is going to make it more annoying without helping its balance too much. I guess it's going to be a bit more functional as a Zuka counter, but it was already good enough at doing that. So I'm just not a fan of this. Finally, Kraken is getting a nerf, taking about 5 frames longer to get a charge attack. I think that this nerf isn't going to be too much of a change. I'm very curious on how the charge attack speed is going to compare to just swimming normally now. I think it'll still be slightly faster. But this will mean counterplay is a bit easier, since you can still knock back the special while it's charging, meaning even though it's immune to knockback is going to have more of an impact, which I think is good. I wish this came with a compensation buff, like with the Reef Slider one, maybe something to incentivize the jump attack a little bit more, but I don't think it's too drastic of a change anyway, so I don't really mind this too much, and I think if a nerf is going to make it so the counterplay feels better against one of the specials that has more limited counterplay, that's probably worth sacrificing the balance a little bit. Finally is points for special to Crack-On and Bloblobber. Both are being decreased by 10. I guess to offset the Kraken nerf on some of the weaker Kraken weapons, sure. Now there are a few more things that are mentioned that I want to talk about before I wrap up. Clam Blitz has a bit of an oddity where sometimes you can score right as the basket closes and it doesn't count and just eats your power clam. It looks like this is also being fixed. There's some quality of life stuff to the photo mode and private battles you can read here, such as having everyone on one team or being able to see this way in Booyah, which is cool. When someone disconnects, there's a bit of a wait before the match is deemed no contest and people can play another one. This time is being shortened, which is great because it's very annoying. There's a lot of notes from the devs here, which I find pretty cool, such as specifying that the Kraken change is to make it so you have to use more of jump attacks and mix them in with charge attacks. However, the most impactful note is at the bottom. We plan on releasing the next update at the end of the current season, which means we will get a season 9, but it's unsure to know if this is with content or not. The seasons would have to reset for X Battle anyway. More importantly though, they mentioned changes to multiplayer balance, including lowering the abilities of select weapons. In other words, the next patch is going to be focused on nerfs. Now this has two possibilities. One, we could nerf annoying stuff like Zuka, Strike, tone back Pencil a little bit, all around tone back the stuff that people want to be changed. Or two, we could drastically lower the main weapon power of all the strong midlines right now, making the meta change completely, possibly for the worse. In my opinion, I think that the strong midlines are the best part about the meta in game right now as a whole, and nerfs to stuff like Stamper or Bucket that are too harsh, I think are not something we want right now. I would rather just see buffs to other other options to make them better. There are definitely some things that need to be nerfed, but I'm very cautious to see what stuff is actually going to get changed here. I could see this being one of the most influential patches in the game's history in terms of defining Splatoon 3's legacy, especially if we're near the end. So I really hope this isn't going to remove the positive attributes of the meta. I know it's a bit stale right now, and trust me, I have put in my fair share of criticism where I can, but the fact that we've had almost the same meta for about a year now, and for the most part people are still enjoying it, is a bit of a testament to the fact that it gets a lot right, and I don't want them to reduce that. So what are my thoughts on the patch as a whole? I think for the most part, this is better in terms of buffs. There are a lot more actually impactful changes, and I'm excited for stuff like S-Blast, Dynamo Roller, or Douser dualies. Even some of the other changes that aren't super meta-defining are generally in better directions that are going to be more impactful for those weapons. And stuff like the Brella latency change or other quality of life stuff they've done is just going to make the game feel a bit better to play. In other words, while the changes might not impact the top level too much, I think it definitely has enough to where I'm curious what could develop from this. If we're doing a buff-focused patch, I think this is much better than the majority of things we've gotten. As for what comes after this, I'm gonna be cautious, but for this patch, I'll give it a thumbs up. Thanks for watching, everyone.